Like what you see here? Then be sure to subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8 for college football history videos and Jaguar Gator 7 for videos on the history of Major League Baseball. And now, on with our feature presentation. September 22nd, 1997. For Jaguars fans, they know exactly what happened on this day, because this was one of the biggest regular season games in franchise history, and might be the loudest that the stadium, which back then was called Alltel Stadium, had ever been. It was the very first Monday Night Football game in Jags history, and man was it a memorable one. Long story short, the Jaguars ended up winning an all-time classic by a final score of 30-21, as with the Jags leading by 2 points with just about no time left in the fourth quarter, and the Steelers lining up for the game-winning field goal, the kick got blocked and returned for a touchdown. Absolute pandemonium, and that's putting it lightly. To win your first ever Monday Night Football game against one of your biggest rivals, and to do it like that? Yeah, that's going to go down in the record books. And there's a reason that this game is still remembered more than a quarter century later. However, that game was marred with a ton of controversy. Mainly, two notable things that I talked about before in a previous video where I went into further detail on the matters, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Number one, you had Steelers head coach Bill Cowher trying to knock out Chris Hudson on the blocked field goal return, stepping onto the field and just losing his cool in the middle of the play. And number two, you had a whole controversy when ABC cut away from the game after the Jaguars scored to make it 29-21, as no one realized until 15 minutes after the fact that, by rule at the time, the Jaguars had to go back onto the field and kick the extra point, even though it didn't matter, and even though there was no time left on the clock. Because of this, the Jaguars-Steelers Monday Night Football game from 1997, as in Jacksonville's Monday night debut, was one of the most controversial games in the history of the program. So the second game that the Jaguars played on Monday Night Football couldn't possibly be any worse than that, right? Surely this game would go off without a hitch, and would be controversy and incident-free, and no one would have anything to worry about or gripe over. However, that's where you'd be wrong. Because after the Jacksonville Jaguars hosted the Miami Dolphins 1 year later in 1998, one of the major talking points was whether or not the Jaguars cheated. Yep, I talked about another Monday Night Football game in the 1980s involving the Dolphins, and whether they allegedly cheated by making it impossible for the Bengals coaches to view the game in their box, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. And about a decade and a half later, this time, the Dolphins were on the other side of the coin, being the victims of alleged cheating that the Jaguars may or may not have orchestrated in order to gain a pretty significant competitive advantage. Because this is the story behind, quite possibly, the craziest cheating controversy in Jacksonville Jaguars history, if you want to call it that, and one of the strangest cheating controversies in the over half-century-long history of Monday Night Football. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of this game, and how the game was going. It's October 12th, 1998. It's week 6 of the NFL season, and we have an absolutely big game down in Duval under the lights in prime time, as we have an in-state battle between the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Miami Dolphins. On paper, this was a game that was absolutely worthy of a primetime fight. Entering the day, the Jaguars were 4-0, and were one of 3 undefeated teams remaining in the NFL, alongside the 6-0 Denver Broncos and the 5-0 Minnesota Vikings. If they won this game, then they would have a 2-game cushion for first place in the division as they tried to win their first AFC Central title ever, while at the same time, keeping pace with the Broncos for the possibility of home field advantage throughout the playoffs. As for the Dolphins, they entered at 3-1, thanks in part to a suffocating defense that through 4 games had allowed just 42 points, or just 10.5 points per game. That was by far the best total in the NFL. Win this game, and you're tied with the New England Patriots for the division lead in the AFC East. Lose this one, and you're next to a whole host of teams with 2 losses in what was setting up to be a super competitive conference when it came to determining the playoff spots. With all that on the line, yeah, this was an absolutely unbelievable game. Heck, in the eyes of some Jags fans, this one might have been a better game than their first Monday Night Football game, as this was a worthy sequel. It started off with fireworks right out of the gate, when Fred Taylor ran for a 77-yard touchdown on the game's very first play from scrimmage. As a side note, to learn more about the absolutely great career of Fred Taylor, click the card in the upper right corner. Some Dolphins fans say that between this game and the divisional round game during the 1999 season 1 year later, that Fred Taylor is still running on Miami to this day. After Jacksonville jumped out to a 14-0 lead in the second quarter thanks to 2 touchdowns by Taylor, Miami scored the ensuing 21 points to take a 21-14 lead into the fourth quarter. Jacksonville tied it up early in the fourth thanks to a 23-yard touchdown pass by Mark Brunell to Keenan McCardle. And then, with the Dolphins lining up for a 54-yard field goal 2 drives later, Olindo Mare missed it. No good. And on the very next play, sure enough, the Jaguars capitalized, with McCardle scoring his second touchdown of the game, this time from 56 yards out, as the Jaguars took a 28-21 lead with just over 2 minutes left. An absolutely thrilling game with an absolutely thrilling finish, as the Jaguars won it by that final score. Alright, so the game was great, and maybe planted the idea in people's minds that Jacksonville should just play all their games on Monday night, because they were 2 for 2 and had 2 of the best Monday night battles of the 1990s. What was possibly controversial about this one? Well, there's the fact that, depending on who you ask, the Jaguars gained quite the competitive advantage by refusing to let the Dolphins practice beforehand on their home field. A lot of times, opposing teams will want to conduct a walkthrough of sorts on the field that they're going to play the game on. This is done for a few reasons, outside of the obvious of just wanting to make sure everyone knows the game plan and going to go over some last-minute things and plays. Number one, especially with a primetime football game, you want to know the lighting situation and how to adjust to the lights, since every stadium's lights are different. And especially since this was not just the first time ever that the Dolphins were playing a game in Jacksonville at Alltel Stadium, but was the first time ever that the Dolphins were playing the Jaguars, period. You want to get a feel for the stadium and the lights, especially since most of the time during the season, you're practicing during the day. And especially since most of your games during the season take place during the day, so lighting isn't an issue. However, a walkthrough like this at the stadium where the game is being played is beneficial from a footing standpoint as well. You want to know what the surface is like. What are the right shoes that I should wear for this? What kind of surface is this? And how will it play? How close are the stands so I have a sense of my bearings if there's a play to the end zone or the sidelines? More than anything, it's just about getting a sense of your surroundings and your environment, which is why Dolphins head coach Jimmy Johnson absolutely wanted to conduct a walkthrough at Alltel Stadium the night before the game. In fact, they wanted to do this so much that they submitted a request in writing to Jacksonville on July 17th, a full 87 days before the game was even set to be played, and right around the time that training camp was starting, to do this. And Jacksonville declined. Not a chance in the world you're conducting a walkthrough at our stadium. You're not going to get that opportunity. You want to conduct a walkthrough? Find somewhere else to do it. But it sure as heck not going to be at Alltel Stadium, which kind of defeats the purpose of the walkthrough. And this made head coach Jimmy Johnson and the Dolphins organization absolutely livid. NFL rules stipulated that you could request a walkthrough of the other team's stadium, and the other team had to accept the offer. Maybe it's because the Jaguars were kind of new to this whole thing. After all, this was just their 4th season, but this was one of those rules that was pretty much common courtesy. Almost like how if you put a player on waivers because they're hurt, and so that they can revert back to IR, you don't claim them. To not let the Dolphins conduct their walkthrough was, in the eyes of many people, especially the Dolphins, complete bush league, and was basically not allowed, especially since NFL rules dictate that if you request a walkthrough at an opposing team's stadium, that they have to give it to you. Was it the reason that the Dolphins couldn't stop Fred Taylor and Keenan McCardle? No. Was it the reason that the Dolphins lost this game? Absolutely not. But did it at least play some part in the Dolphins losing the game and starting off super slowly, being down 14-0 and being so impacted by the field that they allowed a touchdown on the very first play of the game? Perhaps. So you might be wondering, what did the NFL find? If Jacksonville broke the rules, what was their punishment? Again, if you request a walkthrough, the home team is supposed to give you the walkthrough. Not doing so is an unfair competitive advantage that violates the rulebook. However, the Jaguars did not get punished whatsoever for this. And the reason for that? Amazingly enough, despite this being an NFL rule, the Jaguars didn't break any rules. Remember what I said earlier about Jimmy Johnson requesting the walkthrough on July 17th, 87 days before the game? Well, as it turns out, while yes, the home team has to give the away team a walkthrough if they request it, that's only if they request it at least 90 days before. If Jimmy Johnson requested the walkthrough on July 14th, or July 13th, or heck, any day before then, since the schedule was out for a while by this point, then the Jaguars would be obliged to let the Dolphins do this, and then they would be cheating. However, because Johnson missed the deadline by 3 days, the Jags saw this as a lifeline. Due to the incompetence of Miami, they weren't going to bail them out whatsoever. Why should we give you a competitive advantage because you couldn't be bothered to read or follow the rules? You had to do it 90 days before. You did it 87 days before. Sorry, you're out of luck. No walkthrough for you. Lesson learned the hard way. And with that, Miami was unable to conduct a walkthrough at Alltel Stadium, and was unable to do the walkthrough that Jimmy Johnson coveted so badly. But then again, not that badly that he requested it less than 3 months before, instead of any time before that, or even as early as April 2nd, when the schedule was published. And you can bet your bottom dollar that the Dolphins learned their lesson, because the next time they play the Jaguars in Jacksonville, which was in the 1999 divisional round for a shot at the AFC Championship, they made sure that if they wanted the walkthrough, they would have gotten it. Said Johnson, there was a miscommunication as far as what we were allowed to do and not do. For that game, the Dolphins just conducted their final walkthrough at the facility before traveling up to Jacksonville. And based on how they played, the good news was that the Dolphins got a walkthrough at Alltel Stadium during the entire game, because they lost 62-7. Even though the Dolphins and Jaguars aren't rivals in the sense that they don't play in the same division, there are some memorable moments in the in-state rivalry between the sides, and this is definitely one of them. And the rivalry started before the two teams even met due to Jacksonville's reluctance to allow the Dolphins to conduct their walkthrough. The Dolphins were upset that the Jaguars were cheating, but in reality, the Jaguars weren't even cheating or doing anything illegal. This was entirely Miami's fault for being careless and not understanding the rules. It just goes to show you that even in the NFL, when the offseason can be brutally long, and when the days can blend into each other around this time, that 3 days truly can make all the difference. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.